in my impression, after having long discussions about these gems, obviously not all mechanics are clear. Obviously, there are some uncertainties when it comes to AoE changes and like mechanical changes. So to keep that in mind, that anything's bound to change. We've only seen a little bit of footage, and we've only seen some clarifications and some tooltips from GGG. So nothing is by any means set in stone. But my initial impressions are that Ice Spear is primarily a single target ability. I can imagine some people are going to be playing good with Totems, but I think due to the way it's targeting, it just won't be nearly as enjoyable as something like Freeze Pulse or Arc. And as a self-cast means, I can't see it as anything beyond just a single target supplementary ability for some of the other stuff. Arctic Breath is totally busted because it's apparently ground targeted now, which means that due to the description, it would work, hopefully, fingers crossed, the same way Caustic Arrow does, which would indicate that you can leave multiple clouds every time you pierce with it, and it deals a tremendous amount of damage. It has tremendous potential for scalability. It travels on the ground towards next pack of mobs as like some fucked up way to proliferate your damage over time. So if that's actually the case, if that's actually how it works, and it actually just changed the mechanic entirely, because Arctic Breath used to work like Fireball, which means that whenever it chained or it pierced, it wouldn't explode. But due to this being ground targeted, there is suspicion that it works like Caustic Arrow, which would indicate that it does totally work with Pierce. And if it does, then you're going to cover the entire screen with your AoE. And this AoE is going to be doing a lot of damage, because even if you were to compare it to like the current Cold Snap, it does more than enough damage. And you've got insane amounts of scalability now on the skill tree and through things like Occultist, which totally justifies heavy investment into just damage, because you can get your defenses off of your Ascendancy, right? But that doesn't mean that it's necessarily bound to Occultist. I just think that the explosions are paired up really nicely with the creeping stuff. Just makes for a very cool thematic gem. Winter Orb seems good. More than good. It seems great. It is different to Blade Vortex, as in rather than for AoE clearing, you're going to be needing, rather than like with Blade Vortex, you're going to be needing more stacks on average, because the more stacks you have, the higher the base duration is. Therefore, it's easier to keep up more stacks. So I expect most people to run around with 6 to 8 stacks, capping those out on bosses. The single target is a little bit dependent on how much AoE the projectiles themselves have. We don't really know how far you can scale those, what's the base amount of them. But if you were to look at just pure damage values, the cast time, the critical strike chance, the skills, damage effectiveness, it's really, really, really on point. And if you can cover the single target, I think you're totally going to be using this. Maybe even to the extent of using it with something like Cast When Channeling, because it definitely does the damage to cover it. So if you need like Cast While Channeling for a little bit extra single target, or possibly a little bit extra AoE, I think you're gonna be very happy with a Winter Orb. Ice Nova, for whatever reason, got AoE, which means that it's difficult to tell whether or not they've actually modified the initial amount of AoE, since it had the most AoE out of anything in the entire game, but then they give it more AoE. I don't really understand that decision, but it's what it used to be, just kind of like a slow hitting, humongous AoE that covers the entire screen. And I think the Frostbolt utility is still to be disregarded. I don't think anybody's really going to utilize that, but maybe if you can get it to a point where it plays fast enough, you can do that. But I don't see how you would ever do that over Vortex, which I guess we can get to next. But Ice Nova is just solid. It's just solid, and if you want to play Ice Nova, you're totally going to be able to play it, which I think is the case for all of these gems. Which is where we get to Vortex. Vortex is pretty much, I see it the exact same way, which is, it's more like a supplementary ability due to the cooldown. But if you want to use it as its own individual thing, I think it would need modifiers to the current amount of AoE that you get with it, but we don't really know. We haven't seen a video. I think there's a reason why they haven't shown us a video, and it was due to the fact they were experimenting with the just size of it, because I don't see a reason why they would experiment with Ice Nova and then give it more AoE, even though it's the greatest AoE in the game, but then not address the biggest issue of what Vortex has to offer. Yeah, but in terms of damage and everything, and as a supplementary ability for self-casting, it can definitely be quite useful. Stormbrand. So I'm personally pretty disappointed with Stormbrand. Obviously, we're missing out on a lot of information. We don't fully know how it works. We don't even know if it chains properly and how you can scale it. It's just way too new, and it's difficult to tell what it's doing from the videos, because in all of them, they were basically using Arc with like a tiny amount of Stormbrand. So yeah, but just from the pure damage numbers as an initial look, this is probably the thing that I'm most disappointed about. And it seems like the type of ability that's heavily scalable through shock, and that's why GGG just didn't give it a little bit more. I'm not so sure about Stormbrand. This is the one ability where I'm like, this might just not work by itself on its own. It's not going to do enough single target. It's just not going to do enough. Armageddon Brand, which is looking a lot better. And it seems like this skill is a lot more balanced around Brand Recall, which I guess I should have talked about before I explained Stormbrand and Armageddon Brand, because this is like the major thing that makes it work. Okay, so Brand Recall your brands to you, detaching them from enemies and then causing them to activate. So they activate without attaching themselves, which means that you can instantaneously use this ability and it will spawn on your brands on top of you, and it will just attack without them having to attach to anything or travel or anything like that, which is really sick. And then it's got 50% cooldown recovery speed, because it's a 3-second cooldown on the gem itself. We're not quite sure what the quality is, but I assume that it's 15% increased brand attachment range, and it also makes it so that brands refresh their detach duration by up to 1.2 seconds, which I think is only reasonable. And this is a level 6 gem, so it scales a little bit differently. I wish we could see the XP, but whatever. So this is kind of what you have to take into account when judging Stormbrand and Armageddon Brand. And as you can tell, Stormbrand only has a 0.65 second cast time, which is how long it takes for you to cast it. And then it's got an activation every 0.5 second while attached, which means that you can scale that with cast speed and with the new stat, which is frequency of activation or something. And then if you were to compare it to Armageddon Brand, it does more damage. It takes less time for you to cast it, but it activates less frequently because it's only 0.8, which would indicate that it works just better with Brand Recall and it interacts better with duration. But it's a very powerful ignite ability on top of everything, because it does pretty decent amounts of damage, which is 400 to 600, which is 3 times more than Stormbrand, and it's AoE and it's not target capped. And on top of it, it's got 180% more damage with Ignite. So that's a freaking lot. It's only really a matter whether or not you can get enough single target with it, and whether or not your attachment range can exceed the amount of AoE you get for Ignite. Because if your Ignite is bigger, then this is going to be hard to move it around without using Brand Recall. But Brand Recall is only a 1.5 minute cooldown, so, or a 1.5 seconds cooldown. It's not that much. Shattering Steel is hard to talk about. It'll be solid at least, but it depends a lot on how the mechanics of the skill themselves work. We can't really figure it out from the video. A lot of people are assuming a lot of different things, but if what I'm assuming is true, which is that you will be able to hit with the projectile, and then the projectile will also deal AoE damage not only in front of the target but also on top of it, it should be at least a really nice powerful ability for anybody that wants to play a attack-based character, because you can tell it's not a melee skill. So definitely we're going to be seeing like a lot of crit sword builds with stuff like this. Maybe some champions, maybe some other duders scaling through the impale effect. Lancing Steel is like Spectral Throw, but on steroids, pretty much. It's got the single target, it's got the AoE. It's kind of like EK on steroids too, because you can get the spread and it's very much controllable, but then you can also get the single target and like shotgunning to a certain extent with the projectiles themselves, and you've got the stacking impales. It's looking good. I think both of these abilities are going to be strong, but we know less about Shattering Steel, so it's kind of hard to judge. War banners, I think you can go over them individually, but the TLDR that I've got is that they're basically, to me, golems done right, and I really appreciate what GGG did with these things. They will maybe get a little bit out of hand with all the effect and like how many of them you can really place. I think if they're really as they are now, in terms of how many you can get and if you can replace your previous banner and all this sort of stuff, they're just going to get really powerful and they're going to become mandatory on a lot of builds. But goddamn, attack builds need all the help that they can get right now, so in a way I don't really mind it. And it's a little bit unclear as of right now whether or not these things will actually interact with totems and like mines and minions, because if you follow Path of Exile logic, as some people in the chat have pointed out, the skill itself says gain stages by killing enemies while carrying the banner. So if you're playing like a summoner, you're not killing the enemies, your minions are doing it, or a totem or a mine or, you know, a trap. It's not you killing them, it's like all these other effects. So it's a little bit unclear. But yeah, they're pretty much golems done right, in my opinion, where they don't have all the downsides, but it is extra buttons and it's just more fun, which I really appreciate, because I really love vulnerabilities and builds that use multiple skills and that have multiple buttons. So this like cooldown based skill, it's pretty cool. Tectonic Slam, fuck this thing, dude. I hate Tectonic Slam. Okay, I hate the idea of it. I don't like it. It's inconsistent. It's ugly. They made it worse. They made it so that it consumes charges also. And on top of it, it just smells, dude. It sucks. I don't think it's a bad gem. I think people are going to be making solid builds around it. I think if you want to play Tectonic Slam, you're going to have your fun. I think if it just fits you thematically and it's a skill that you want to make a build around, it'll totally be fine. Worst case scenario, it'll be fine. I think it's going to be a solid ability, but me personally, I just don't like what they did with it, and I don't like inconsistent builds, so I'm not going to play with it. Screw this thing. But if you want to play a solid ability, you'll be totally fine with Tectonic Slam, and you're going to be able to do all content and all this sort of stuff, all right? Don't even worry about it. Multiple totem support, another really cool gem. They've clarified now that instead of having 40% less damage, you get it all the way down to 21, which is cool. It opens up a lot of opportunities with the Hierophant changes for other ascendancies to be viable with totems again. So getting more placement speed anywhere but Hierophant is really cool. And obviously casting multiple totems at the same time is very nice. It will make it so that you're going to be dealing less single target damage, but that's not really something that totems ever struggled with. So this, in my opinion, tackles the biggest issues that totems have currently, which is having enough totems on the ground whenever your totems get destroyed, attack, whatever. And also, yeah, locking down totems almost entirely to Hierophant, especially for like the early stages of the game where it's just such a powerful class. But now it's a little bit more spread out, and I think overall everybody's going to be much happier with totems as a whole, because you can make a decision of where do I want to get my damage. Do I do it through using multiple totems and then speccing into an ascendancy that's powerful, or do I do it through just, you know, the easy old stuff with Hierophant, right? You can maybe play like Shadow Totem builds now again. It's crazy. And Bone Chill, the other support gem announced in the thing, is just pretty nutty. It seems like we're getting so much scaling for the cold damage over time. It's going to be just really meta, which I'm a big fan of. But yeah, it's going to be like 60% increased cold damage over time and like 30% increased cold damage on average. Granted, if you can chill things for the full power of chill, which would be 30%. So yeah, you're gonna have to hit things twice, but it makes for one of the best support gems for those sort of abilities. And yeah, it's definitely gonna help out a lot. Although you already have like a great number of multipliers already for Cold Staff, so you know, I don't see it being too much, but yeah, you have a lot of different support gems to choose now from. So those are just my initial thoughts without having all the information and without having all the everything about this. All right, there's only so much we can figure out with how little information we have, because at the end of the day, the thing that matters the most is how these skills work mechanically, and not really if they do enough damage. It's not that difficult in Path of Exile right now to make any skill do enough damage. The problem is that some skills are just inferior mechanically, and that's where all the problems come from.